Well, good afternoon. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Lynn Farabent, and I'm the Senior Manager for Government Relations with AAPM. And I want to talk today in a little different focus about some of the challenges in complying with regulations. And this is not a SAM session, but take your clickers out because I do have a series of questions and I would like to see what your distribution of responses are. So the first scenario I want to talk to is you declare that Mondays are free beer days for all medical physicists. Today's a Monday. Did you just create a regulation? Select your answers. Click now. Okay. Oh. Interesting. Okay. Next scenario. Maybe. Melissa Martin, President-elect of AAPM, declares that Mondays are free beer days for all medical physicists. Did she create a regulation? Okay, slightly different distribution. Third scenario. President Obama issues an executive order declaring that Mondays are free beer days for all medical physicists. Did President Obama create a regulation? Ah, interesting distribution. Final scenario. The U.S. Congress passes Senate Bill XXX, stating Mondays, get the theme? Is this, President Obama signs the Senate bill that's passed by Congress, is this a regulation? Ah, very interesting. Now we're going to take a look at the results. The first scenario, no. Just because you declare it doesn't make it so outright. There may be situations, and we'll get to this a little later in my talk, that depending on who the you is, that answer could be yes. Second scenario, where Melissa declares it, maybe. But what you need to ask is, does she have the authority to make such a statement? And is that a statement then enforceable? and a little bit behind my thought process in defining the scenario, I could have used Bruce as president. I could have used the board. Some of the subtleties in that response would have been very different if you were a medical physicist that's an AAPM member. Third scenario. Does the president, through an executive order, have the authority to make and enforce such a statement? We treat executive orders, for the most part, that he does. Okay? So I would say yes. However, if you have been following any of the recent political discussions, there have been numerous cases, or a couple of cases, where there have been entities, political entities, that are questioning whether or not President Obama has the right to take action through the executive order process. Okay? That whole answer and concept could change should we have a judicial decision. But for the most part, when an executive order is issued by a president, it is treated as if it is a regulation. Final scenario. No, Congress does not make regulation. They make a statute or a law. Okay? So we're going to probe this a little bit to see exactly what the subtle differences might or might not be. So what is the definition of a statute? You can Google this, you can get a variety. I chose to use Webster for the purposes of this talk. The essence of the definitions are all very similar. The full definition of a statute: it's a law enacted by a legislative branch of government. Very key, a legislative branch. It's an act of a corporation or its founder intended as a permanent rule. Or it's an intentional instrument setting up an agency and regulating its scope of authority, okay? So a statute in our area would be the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 and all of its amendments. Within that act, it set up a process for the creation of federal agencies to deal with radioactive materials. That's one way to think of it. So what's the definition of a regulation? Well, according to Webster, the definition is the act of regulating or the state of being regulated. It's an authoritative rule dealing with details or procedures. And this is interesting. In Webster, the example is safety regulations. They could have picked anything for their example. Or it's a rule or order issued by an executive authority or agency of the government having the force of law. Okay, so that's a general definition from Webster. I also thought it was interesting to look at this definition based out of a business dictionary. In general, a principle or a rule with or without the coercive power of law employed in controlling, directing, or managing an activity, organization, or a system, and a law, a rule based on and meant to carry out a specific piece of legislation. So very key is that enabling act, that enabling statute. And they are usually enforced by a regulatory agency formed or mandated to carry that out. So where am I going with this, you're probably asking? Well, let's look at statute versus regulations, okay? We can have a lot of statutes, okay, and they'll exist on paper. But unless someone's directed to enact a regulation, is there really the meat on that? Typically, a statute will be written at a very high, broad level. It will say XYZ is directed or has the authority to promulgate regulations in this area. What does that mean? Well, until those regulations are put on paper and defined, we have nothing more than that. Regulations have the force and effect of law, meaning that they are as enforceable as statutes, because it's the statute that gives the agency that issues that regulation that power. So at the federal level, executive branch agencies get their authority to make law, to make regulation, when Congress delegates that authority to them. Laws resulting from the agency's legislative-related activities are called regulations, and they look a lot like statutes, okay? But laws resulting from an agency's, quote, judicial activities are called decisions and look a lot like case law, okay? So keep that in mind, because we're going to get to some examples in our regulatory world. Now, statutes. They can be 1 page long, a half a page long, hundreds of pages long, or thousands of pages long, okay? Is it necessary to read them, or is it a waste of your time? Okay, I should have asked a question on that before going into this. It is necessary that someone reads them, okay? It may not be necessary for all 8,400 members of AAPM to read them, but I will tell you, from a member perspective, you better want Richard and I to be reading them and Bill, okay? Because if the agency develops regulation that exceeds the authority and scope that was given to them by the passage of the statute, we have grounds to question that regulation, okay? We can only judge the validity of the regulation if, in fact, we read the statute, okay? Otherwise, how do you know whether they've stayed within that scope of authority they were given? Regulations are published in 2 official sources. This is just for information, so that if you should want to do what Richard and I do every morning, which is sit and read the Federal Register, you're welcome to. And the second source is the Code of Federal Regulations, okay? The Federal Register regs are chronological. So it comes out every day, 5 days a week. Doesn't come out Saturday. It is not a dated issue, Saturday and Sunday. I actually receive Monday's Federal Register on Saturday, okay, because it really goes to print on Friday, all right? The Code of Federal Regulations, however, takes those laws, those regulations that are issued in a chronological manner and packages them in an area of relationship. So for example, for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, all right, NRC regs are in what's called Title 10 of the Code of Federal Regulation. And there's, I believe, 50 titles of the Code of Regulations. So in essence, you can think of it as 50 separate book chapters that are unique for that area. Now, administrative decisions. How do they fit in, and what are they? Most federal agencies will also issue administrative decisions or interpretations. And these often and mainly arise from their enforcement actions, okay? If an agency levels fines for violations of their regulations, they must determine which regulation is first violated. Hence, why there's an enforcement arm or an inspection arm of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or an agreement state. They can often hold a hearing, but they issue a written decision on the interpretation of the regulation, okay? We can gain insight from reading these when they're issued. Okay. Andrea Brown spoke to the imaging session yesterday. Andrea is a board-certified medical physicist. She happens to be employed part-time by the Joint Commission, okay? Andrea made a lot of statements yesterday, and we had not talked about the specifics of her talk, but she made a lot of statements that I'm going to come back to in a couple of examples, but I couldn't have paid her better to emphasize some of the points she was emphasizing yesterday. But let's take a look at pre-accreditation pre-MIPA, okay? We have radiation oncology accreditation. We have right now today, and this was not necessarily pre-MIPA, although it was because ACR and ASTRO was joint, but we have 3 accrediting bodies that have radiation oncology accreditation programs. ACR started in 1987, ACRO in 1995, and ASTRO as a standalone accrediting organization in 2014. All of these programs have standards or requirements that they have established that their accreditation requirements are based on. In imaging accreditation, accreditation programs. In 2002, they started accrediting PET, 2002 CT, 1996 MR, 1999 nuke med, 1987 mammography, and 1987 radiation oncology. For IAC, in 1997, vascular testing, which used to be called ICAVL, 1996 echocardiography, 97 nuclear and PET, 2000 MR, 2007 CT, and then 2011 dental CT, 2010 carotid stenting, 2013 vein center, and 2014 cardiac electrophysiology. Now, the latter ones obviously came after MIPA, because MIPA was passed in 2008. Prior to MIPA, okay, how many of you would say the ACR's accreditation requirements were regulation and binding? Just show me a show of hands. Nobody? Oh, okay. Prior to MQSA and prior to MIPA, how many of you would say ACR's accreditation requirements were regulation and binding on a facility? Okay, most of you are shaking your head no. Could you get accredited without meeting those requirements? So are they being deemed a regulation because you would not pass the accreditation if you ignored the requirements that ACR put forward for you to, quote, get their seal of accreditation? Okay? Think about it. In 2008, the Medicare Improvements for Patient and Providers Act was passed by Congress and signed into law in August of 2008. It contains provisions for facility accreditation standards for four what's called advanced imaging modalities. The imaging guys are certainly familiar with this. CT, MR, nuclear medicine, and PET. It also authorized, remember, MIPA is a statute, okay? It authorized the Secretary of Health and Human Services to specify other imaging, diagnostic imaging services in consultation with physician, specialty organizations, and other stakeholders, and it expressly, in statute, excluded X-ray, ultrasound, and fluoroscopy, okay? That's why we don't have those. It mandated that beginning in January 2012, that any entity performing the technical component of these advanced imaging services, including a physician's office, would be required to receive accreditation from an agency approved by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, okay? So the statute set the broad policy. It directed the authority to the Secretary of Health and Human Services to implement how they chose fit. And it also directed them that based on some criteria to recognize national accrediting organizations. It only applies to physician offices and freestanding. It does not apply to hospital-based imaging, even in the advanced modality under MIPA. Okay? The Joint Commission, under different authority, may cause you to have to do some of the same things, but it is not MIPA-driven. CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, recognized 4 accrediting bodies: the American College of Radiology, the Intersocietal Accreditation Commission, the Joint Commission. Those were the first 3, and then a 4th rad site. Just out of curiosity, how many here have dealt with a facility or work at a facility that is accredited by RadSite? One. Okay. With the passage of MIPA for the advanced modalities, imaging modalities, the accreditation requirements of those 4 recognized entities now have the force of law behind them, okay? Any other imaging modality in an accreditation program or the radiation oncology accreditation programs are all voluntary. So you need to think about that for those who answered, are the accreditation requirements really regulation? And what's the power of not doing them? Obviously, the power of not doing them is you don't get the little facility accredited by symbol to use for marketing purposes. But what does that really mean? Okay? And how do we deal with the situation of where an accrediting requirement is in conflict with state or federal regulation? As Andrea said in the Joint Commission discussion yesterday, the Joint Commission comes into a facility and follows the patient through from A to B. So if that patient has an imaging study done, it's likely to bring up a review of the imaging program, okay? Their standards are written with very little substance or direction. They will say you have to do X, but they're not going to tell you how to do X. But what they're going to look at, and this is not dissimilar in a licensing situation or a registration certificate from a state or a federal agency, what they will look at is what you have put on paper and committed to doing in your policies and procedures. And that's what the Joint Commission scores you against, and that's what they're going to hold you against. All right? Now let's take a look a little bit differently. And I've chosen just 3 as an example. The International Electrotechnical Commission, or IEC standards. IEC is the leading organization for the preparation and publication of international standards for all electrical, electronic, and related technologies. They provide a platform to companies, industries, and governments for meeting, discussing, and developing the standards they require. They are fully consensus-based and represent the needs of key stakeholders of every nation participating in IEC work. And every member country, no matter how big or how small, has a single vote. Okay? The US has 1 vote. Any small country also has 1 vote. Okay, so one could say, can there be undue influence from some of the countries to help encourage other countries to vote a certain way? All right? So an IEC standard is a consensus-reviewed paired document voted and issued then based on the countries that participate. Now let's look at the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements. How many of you realized before this slide that it was chartered by Congress? A few. A lot of the hands that went up are NCRP council members. They better know this. It was chartered by Congress in 1964. Again, a statute was issued. It's Public Law 88-376. And it was signed July 14th. This is a link to the charter. In the charter to the NCRP, there are 4 objectives of NCRP. Before we go into the objectives, I just want to see, somebody tell me what they think one objective of NCRP is. Okay? In what manner? Recommendations, radiation protection, okay? These are the 4 objectives, and there's a lot of words up here, but you're going to have these slides, and I really wanted you to have the formal words from the charter, not my synthesizing of it. But let's look at them. First, it's to collect, analyze, develop, and disseminate in the public interest information and recommendations about A, protection against radiation or radiation protection, radiation measurements, quantities, and units, particularly those concerned with radiation protection. 2, provide a means by which organizations concerned with the scientific and related aspects of radiation protections and quantities, units, and measurements may cooperate for effective utilization of their combined resources and to stimulate the work of such organizations. 3, develop basic concepts, again, about quantities, units, and measurements, and the application of these concepts, and about radiation protection. Radiation protection, very big theme. And then 4, to cooperate with the International Commission on Radiological Protection, Federal Radiation Council, which doesn't exist anymore, although the Environmental Protection Agency has aspects of what the FRC had been charged to do, the International Commission on Radiation Units and Measurements, ICRU, and other national and international organizations, governmental and private, concerned with radiation quantities, units, measurements, and radiation protection, okay? NCRP is chartered by Congress. Does NCRP receive any direct funding from Congress? Correct. I would argue, and in full disclosure, I had been a staff scientist with NCRP before going to the American College of Radiology and coming to AAPM. It has been a subject of debate over the years. They don't believe they should ask Congress for direct funding. However, the bulk of their funding is passed through a federal agency. So I'm not sure what the difference would be, other than they would have a line item in the congressional budget, which one could argue should be steady to help offset operating costs. And other things could be over and above that. All right? So they were chartered in the public interest to disseminate information and recommendations. Now, the International Commission on Radiation Protection, it was formed in 1928. It's an independent international organization with more than 200 volunteer members, approximately 30 countries across 6 continents. They represent leading societies and policymakers in the field of radiological protection, and ICRP, again, is funded through contributions from organizations with interest. So now, get your clickers, I have a series of questions for you. This is what ICRP publishes. All right, IEC documents. Are they regulations? Yes or no? I feel like music should be playing. Very good. They are not regulations unto themselves. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Are NCRP documents regulations? Very good. They are not regulations. They are also not a peer-reviewed standard. Keep that in mind for a minute. And finally, our ICRP documents regulations. Very good. They are not regulations either unto themselves. Okay. There is an executive order that says, and it has been an executive order for several presidents, okay? Off the top of my head, I think it was first issued by President Reagan, or I'm pretty sure it was President Reagan, but I will find that out for you, which directs the federal agencies before developing a standard on their own to consider if there is an existing peer-reviewed standard in place for that subject matter, okay? Remember I said NCRP and ICRP documents are not peer-reviewed standards. Do our regulatory agencies, such as NRC, need to consider an NCRP document, even if they have paid for that NCRP document to be developed and issued? Do they have to consider that? Not under that executive order, okay? Do most agencies? Yes, because it is viewed as a U.S. authoritative source. But there is nothing in law or statute, even though they're congressionally chartered, that says the agency has to consider their recommendations. All right? Now we're going to look a little bit, though, through the NRC regulatory scheme. It has enabling legislation. NRC exists because of the Atomic Energy Act and its subsequent acts that have amended it. NRC issues policy statements, regulations. One could petition for a rulemaking. They have license conditions. They have guidance documents. They issue regulatory issue summaries, which are often as a result of an enforcement action, and they have enforcement actions. So at the top is for our purposes, is the medical policy statement. That's a link to the policy statement. But in a nutshell, it says NRC will not intrude into the medical judgment affecting patients except as necessary for the radiation safety of workers and the general public. All right? And when justified by the risk to patient, regulate the radiation safety of patients primarily to ensure the use of radionuclides is in accordance with physician directives. And consider industry and professional standards that define acceptable approaches of achieving radiation safety. Okay? Professional standards. All right? Our AAPM task force reports professional standards. Do the regulatory authorities consider them a professional standard? Yes, they do, incorrectly. Regulations can be agency initiated, or one can file a petition for rulemaking, either as an individual or an organization. AAPM has a pending petition for rulemaking. We submitted it in 2006. We still do not have final rule and resolution on that. But we were successful in submitting it. I gave you a flow diagram that is off of the NRC website that outlines what a petition for rulemaking process would look like graphically. But basically, when you write a petition for rule, you have to write it as if it was the agency writing the regulations. So you have to go through all of the steps. We have to do a regulatory cost benefit. We have to look at the cost benefit of the rule. We have to look at the impact. And we have to develop all of that. And AAPM did that. So let's look at current rulemaking procedures. Part 35 was first published in 2000, most recently published as a proposed rule in July of 2014. The comment period closed in November. These were the areas. We don't have a final rule. It was supposed to have gone to the commission last fall. All rulemaking was held up at the commission. There is a project at NRC called Project AIM that one aspect they are doing is looking at every rulemaking initiative by the agency. Some will never be finalized, and they are ranking them as to which should be finalized. I'm hoping Part 35 is in the category to be finalized, but we don't know because it hasn't gone forward to the commission yet. We hope spring of 2016, we hope to hear more about this at the upcoming Advisory Committee on Medical Uses of Isotope. Part 20, Standards for Protection of Radiation, Against Radiation. Again, published as an advance notice of proposed rule. An advance notice of proposed rule is normally an action an agency wants to get early on public comment. They're considering doing a proposed rule, but they really want feedback. So they publish what's called an advance notice, okay? From an advance notice to the final rule, you may see very close similarities, and you may say, oh my God, how were these two ever connected, okay? Comments were due November of 2014. It was extended to March of 2015, and it was extended a second time to June of 2015. One major reason it was extended, does anybody know, other than Richard? It was extended because it references an ICRP document, and ICRP documents are not free to the public to review. The antis of concern said we cannot afford to buy the ICRP documents, and therefore it's unfair for us to be able to make comment. Well, after almost a year of this, the commission said, we're closing the comment period, okay? Most of us knew those who were going to comment had copies of ICRP 107. And NRC is currently evaluating to see what the next step is. Patient release, this just closed. We have had a couple of commissioners, including the former chairwoman, who believes that we should not be releasing patients after iodine therapy, that they should all be kept in the hospital. Allowing them to go home is a bad thing. Allowing those who choose to go to our hotel is a terrible thing. And therefore, we need to go back and relook at this. This has been, in the last 6 years, probably relooked at 5 different times. Congress has looked at this. Congress has, current Senator Markey, when he was a Representative Markey, has a report that was issued called Radiation Roulette, and it was referring to the open doors of releasing patients and exposing others in the public unknowingly. There were 2 public meetings held. The comment period closed, and the focus of this was to obtain information. What sort of instructions do licensees give? Should NRC have a website for this? We filed comments, SNNMI filed comments, others filed comments. I didn't pull up everybody. Our comment letter is up on the Government Affairs page, and I provided the link to SNM. Basically, we said NRC should not get into the business of running a website to provide information to patients because they would never be up to date. And there is information in other sources that are more appropriate for where a patient should be referred to for information. There's been a lot of discussion on the LNT model, in part on the listserv, on the BBS for AAPM, and part of it, I think, has been stimulated by these 3 petitions for rulemaking. They're essentially identical. PRM means petition for rulemaking. 20 is the cycle year, and 28, 29, and 30 was the 28th petition for rulemaking in that cycle period for NRC, et cetera. NRC reviewed, docketed, and published for public comment. All this means is the petition that was submitted met the checklist to say it met all of the requirements to be considered a valid petition. It has no indication that the agency thought it was valid from a technical standpoint. It was simply administratively valid to be looked at, okay? We filed comments and we basically said, at this point in time, there's no or little basis scientifically to lead us to move to rulemaking, and that further analysis should be done, okay? A lot of others were in that same boat with us. Part 37, I want to end with this one because actually I just saw a listserv email come in saying, guys in New Jersey, time is running out. Does somebody have a checklist I can use to look at meeting the regulation? If you look at it, it was first published in March of 2013 with an effective date for NRC licensees of March of 2014, and an agreement state had an additional 2 years, and that's closing this month. So I expect I'm going to see a lot of furor on the RSO listserv, on the MedPhys listserv. I wouldn't be surprised if there's not a BBS that comes up on it. The key requirements, this is for increased controls, Category 1 and Category 2 sources. For us today, that means Gamma Knife, ViewRay, blood irradiators, HDR. It does not mean brachytherapy sources, okay? Does not mean Molly generators. And NRC, because the Government Accountability Office did a study and said, oh, it's terrible, the program NRC's that we're not safely in securing radioactive materials, and NRC got a big negative mark. The rule wasn't even finalized when the GAO study was done. So there was an effort. We worked with a lot of individuals on Congress, and basically we got killed a congressional amendment that would have taken another direction and said NRC needs to just assess programs and report to Congress evaluating the effectiveness of the Part 37 rule no later than December of this year, okay? The reason I bring this up is last year Senator Feinstein from California introduced an amendment to the appropriations bill that funds the NRC and the Department of Energy, in part, and we fought it, okay? Currently, there's an amendment from Senator Carper, who the amendment to this year's appropriation bill reads almost identical to the Feinstein bill that we got squashed, all right? Do I think it's going to go anywhere this year? We are in a presidential election year unlike any other we have seen, okay? There will not be, and one could question whether there is anything being done now, but there will be very little to nothing done after June of this year. We have the conventions this summer, and then they're all going to be out of DC running for office. Okay, those that are up for re-election. 1/3 of the Senate, everybody in the House, and the President. Okay? But I have spent, over the past 3 weeks, I had a meeting with Senate Energy and Health staff and House Energy and Commerce staff, along with Matt Ryder from Bill's office, to go up and sit down with the committee staffers who will monitor the X number of amendments to the energy appropriations bill. It's very important we take the time to meet with these people, that we have Capital Associates letting us know that these amendments are pending and that do we need to take action? Because what's going to happen, and what typically happens, is it could be 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the morning, and things are going to start getting tagged onto a piece of legislation that may be the only piece of legislation to move this year, either on the House or the Senate side. So if we don't do this early education and warning, we have no hope of stopping it. Can I tell you that by us doing all of this, we're going to stop it? No. I can tell you, though, if we're not up doing it, we have no hope of stopping it, okay? Why is this of concern? I have the biggest uneasiness in over 30 years on an issue, and that is, the issue is there are those in Congress and in other agencies and anti-organizations that believe we should not be utilizing Category 1 and Category 2 sources, which for us includes cobalt-60, okay, and cesium chloride, in any manner, shape, or form. That they should be banned, and we should be looking at alternative technologies. Whether or not that alternative technology exists today, can do the same thing, or not. And the reason for this is they're concerned about malevolent use of that material to create a dirty bomb. All right? So why is that of concern today? I don't know how many of you have seen the newspapers recently. There have been several recent thefts there have been industrial radiography cameras. There was one press release said, ISIS now has the material to make a dirty bomb. Okay, it was an industrial radiography camera stolen from a U.S. contractor's site in Iraq. It has subsequently been found. It was intact. ISIS did not have access to that. Does that mean they don't have access to other radioactive material? I can only speculate. Last week, there was an industrial radiography camera stolen in Mexico. I haven't seen that one's been retrieved. They just retrieved a source that was lost in October of last year in Illinois, so in the U.S., They found it on a farmer's yard, intact. But again, these headlines keep causing this to permutate. I don't know how many in here watch a show called Madam Secretary. There was a 2-part episode just 3 weeks ago of a dirty bomb going off in DC. The husband of the Secretary of State in this show was at ground zero, was exposed. The first episode showed him having radioactive burns, in essence, to his hands. The second episode, they went through all of the machinations to determine what the internal dosimetry was. They made a statement that he got a dose of 1 millisievert and therefore he's okay. Okay? And the show went on. Okay? Why do I say this? This is the type of stuff that those who want to shut down the use of radioactive materials continue to use. It continues to percolate. So, just for you to think, do you think the media is hyping the dangers of dirty bombs? Okay, it's one of my favorite clips after 9/11. I brought it back out for this talk. My concern is that I have no problem if there's efforts to reduce or increase controls on radioactive materials of significance. I have a problem if that same level of security and risk assessment is not being done on biologics and chemicals. And right now, that parity doesn't exist for those who want to pull the use of radioactive materials. So, to wrap up, and I know I'm a couple minutes over, one way to look at this is the statute is the naked skeleton. A regulation, you add the muscular system to it. Guidance documents, now, I didn't spend a lot of time on guidance documents, okay? There are several activities that NRC is regulating under 10 CFR Part 1000, and the specifics of which are in guidance documents. Those guidance documents are non-binding to the agreement states, okay? Regulation by guidance is simply regulation by guidance. It is not binding. It becomes binding when NRC attaches that guidance to your license as an amendment to your license, okay? We add the skin. That's sort of what guidance does. It will give you a description of how to meet the regulation that the agency finds acceptable. Do not ever, on an amendment or a new license, commit yourself to everything in New Reg 1556, Volume 9, or any other NRC guidance or regulatory guide. Once you do and it's put on your license, you are held to everything that's in there. They were not written for you to be able to meet everything. There is contradictory information. It's as if a state agency incorporates by reference TG 142 or 151. They were not intended to be written and put into regulation in that manner. And finally, the license is fully clothed. That wraps up the entire package. What you say to the agency in that, they will attach your operating procedure date to it, and you are therefore held and bound to that. Thank you. Any questions?
I just have a comment. With regard to Iridium-192, the Category 2 level is 21.6 curies, so unless you have more than one HDR unit, it really doesn't apply.
That is correct. And do you want to know why that is the case?
Two sources change.
Nope. We did very hard to get all of the licenses and the quantities per source down under 20 curies before that went into place. But thank you. Question, comment?
Yeah, regarding your last comment, you seemed very passionate that guidance documents are not to be incorporated into regulation. How hard does the AAPM, what type of effort do they put forth reinforcing this to regulatory agencies?
Actually, we put a lot of time in working with the Conference of Radiation Control Program Directors and in discussions with NRC.
Which
that
still seem to adopt the guidance documents as the CRC, as
they have
the
not
SSRs.
adopted anything recently. And in essence, that was part of the genesis behind why AAPM is now developing medical physics practice guidelines. Part of the genesis behind the practice guidelines was with the idea that if a regulator wanted to incorporate it, that's the document we would be comfortable with them incorporating.
The ACR seems to not have that problem with any of their guidance documents being incorporated into regulatory material. Why do you think that is?
Which documents from ACR are you talking about? Their
Well, they have
accreditation requirements?
No, they have standards for
Their
external
practice
beam rate.
parameters and
Yes.
technical standards?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not aware of a practice parameter or a technical standard incorporated into any state law that I'm aware of.
That's my point.
Why?
They seem to avoid it, but we can't seem to
Because
avoid
for
it.
physics, we are acknowledged by the state entities as AAPM is the body of knowledge. And if you look at many of the ACR technical standards, they reference AAPM task group reports
Yeah.
in many cases.
Fair enough.
But AAPM is, the scientific task group reports are really recognized by the state regulatory agencies as, I will use in quotes, an authoritative source. The problem with it is they don't understand that there are contradictory statements in some of the task group reports. They weren't written with the intent to become regulation. So we
Right.
spent
Yeah.
a lot of time
Sure.
working to educate them, and we have seen a lot of progress in the recent past 5 years, I would say.
And then a second question I have is, by statute, who has the power to rescind regulations? So in other words, when the NRC rescinds regulation,
Rescinds or amends?
either. What I was getting at is you were basically accepting executive action as regulation.
The executive order directive from the president.
Executive order, right.
Yes.
So if it
And-
becomes a
And he would
regulation-
argue that that comes from his legislative authority for the office of the president,
Right.
okay? That's a very broad interpretation. I think a federal agency can, there are a couple ways. There
My
could be
understanding
a-
is they modify or rescind their own regulations, and then they present them to Congress for,
No, they do
not
not
true,
present their
for
regs to
approval?
Congress, no.
so they've completely been delegated the authority to make regulation.
Yes.
And to modify regulation. Right.
Right.
So if
Right.
an executive order becomes regulation that falls under the jurisdiction or authority of the NRC, can the NRC not change that regulation then?
Yeah, I can't think of any scenario. I mean,
Okay.
right. Except for NRC does issue orders and does regulate by orders, and they did this under Part 30, before Part 37 for increased controls. And part of it was done under national defense and security, which brings in a whole other set of issues and stuff. And one of the reasons Part 37 exists is we all made very loud noise before the commission that they should not regulate for a long period of time by order, okay? And that is really why we have Part 37, and all of the orders have either been rescinded or in the agreement states will be rescinded as of the end of this month.
Thank you.
Tony?
Great job, Lynn. You know, just
Thank
the comment related to peer review. We try to do internal peer review in the APM, and I guarantee you that the NCRP is better than any public peer review that they could ever do on their documents, internal with the council And I just wanted to point that out, that it's peer review cubed. It is not just a public peer review. So I think the value of peer review is how good is the peer review? You don't know. I think that what we're doing in the APM is a great thing. You just alluded to it just a minute ago.
Yep.
And we have to do that. We have to continue to do that.
I think the difference is an IEC document, an ANSI document, an ASME standard, an ASTM standard goes through a public review process.
Right.
NCRP in the past 5 years or so has finally started
Yeah.
opening it up, and in part was based on these discussions 15 years ago and some of the new direction that has come out.
Yeah, and they are getting comments
Right.
back from the public, but it still isn't truly public
Right.
peer review. I know John
And-
Boyce has been doing a lot, pushing that big
Right.
time, so.
And as far as AAPM task group reports, currently, other than practice guidelines, which are not a task group report, they're a practice guideline,
They are
they are
peer
the only document that goes out for public review.
I
from
just
the-
wanted to point that out.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, I appreciate it, because, again, it's not black and white, and the areas of gray are great. The degrees of gray are great on this. Final question or comment?
Okay, thank you for an interesting presentation. You can choose whether to, if this is a question that's worth answering in front of everybody. I don't know its value. For public review of, like, requests for comment from the public, putting things up, in your experience, how successful is that? Like, what demographics of the general public actually participate in this thing? Is it only people who have a vested interest, or
Depends on the topic. When I was with NRC and I was doing reactor licensing for the Seabrook nuclear power plant for the environmental impact statement for our operating license, I had in my area alone 900 comments from the public that included such things as what made me think I was qualified to write an environmental impact statement on a nuclear power plant, since I wasn't qualified to do a teddy bear's picnic. Okay? Every comment is reviewed. Some give us chuckles. Every comment has a roll-up of a series of comments has a response published. It really depends on the topic and the interest. On waste-related, there are a lot of not in my backyard comments from general members of the public or members of the public that have been organized by some entity. Seabrook, for example, the Clamshell Alliance, the original members of the Clamshell Alliance did not live in New England. It held up Seabrook for a number of years.
so overall you think that they are a useful, and they're doing their job, you think, at this point still?
Overall, I would say it is the best process that we have, and I personally know changes have been made from advanced notice of proposed rule language to final language based on public comment.
Okay, thank you.
You've probably already heard about this, but where I practice in New York City, we are an agreement city. You've probably already heard that there is a push to essentially update the regulations to a site-by-reference approach. I have not come across this. I am not sure, are any other agreement states or jurisdictions doing this approach? And off the top of your head, what are the implications of this to me as a recipient or, somebody that has to follow this?
There, in many regulations, there's already reference or incorporation to requirements by reference site. We are working right now with the Conference of Radiation Control Program Directors and the FDA. FDA is pushing CRCPD to incorporate by reference IEC standards, because FDA is going to go in that direction because it takes them too long to promulgate their own, and they're trying to live with the executive order mandate, okay? One of the things we're looking at, first off, is does an IEC standard, which is really developed for the manufacturer to follow, does it really apply to the end user? And how does it apply to the end user? There are a number of states who are, by their legislative authority or their enabling statute, are not allowed to incorporate by reference in their regulation. Okay? The fact that IEC documents are expensive and not publicly available throws another level of wrinkle into this. So yes, we are right now very active in that area. FDA also, though, already has, and they do it in radiation therapy more so than imaging, they already have a process of where they can incorporate by reference other standards into, rather than developing it, and have done so. So it's something we're looking at. I can argue it both ways, and I guess I can argue it both ways because I've been on both sides of the table. And that's where it gets down to, was there really a widely acceptable true peer review process, or was that peer review process really limited to those that an entity opted to make the document available to? Okay? So, for example, the fact that NCRP documents now come out to all of the collaborating organizations, of which AAPM, we've got an NCRP and an ICRP report right now that's out for comment, we're looking at. Years ago, that was not done, okay? Now, do they weight those comments the same as a comment from an NCRP counselor? I can tell you they don't. Because the only one that can hold up an NCRP report from being issued, it takes 2 no votes on the final approval of the council. So it has to be a voting counselor, and it takes 2 of them to cause the document not to go forward and to be basically re-looked at. So now that's not to say if 10 outside organizations said they had issues with it, that it wouldn't be taken seriously. But process-wise, it's 2 counselors or more are the only ones that can hold up and stop the issuance of an NCRP report.
Okay, so I guess for my selfish perspective is I'm going to have to go back to my jurisdiction and say, wait, hold your horses about this site by reference. I don't quite understand all of it yet, because I'm more concerned about the X-ray portion of the site by reference rather than the radioactive materials, because NRC CFRs
Right.
are pretty well.
Well, and that's where the FDA thing is. It's really, it has nothing to do truly with the material use. It's all on the X-ray side is what we're looking at right now. Because FDA has no authority over radioactive materials, other than, as Sally Schwartz talked about today, the FDA process for approving a radiopharmaceutical or a drug.
Yes.
Or contrast agent.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.